end with Nathan Rao, who's been a writer on many political issues over the years when he's in Toronto. He's been living in Paris since 2012, and he's been very active in the anti-capitalist part of the NPA in France. He will wrap up.
Well, it's really nice to be here for my annual Toronto talk. I'm still in a bit of a state of shock. This is the first time during my visit this summer in this neighborhood, so I'm still a bit of a shock that there's nothing across the street anymore. But anyway, that's the part of Toronto that's disappearing, I suppose. So yes, thanks to Greg and Patricia for putting this together, as they have done every year. Greg mentioned that I'm an active member of the NPA. Well, for the usual reasons of work and parental obligations, it would be hard for me to say I'm an active member of the NPA. I would like to say that I'm an active supporter, but for reasons that I hope will also come out in my talk, I'm kind of rethinking a lot of things in light of developments over recent years, and part of my reason for not being an active member of the NPA is that aside from the fact that the NPA has been going through a very serious crisis, I've been doing a lot of rethinking, and I hope some of that will come out, because as Parastu said, Greg had asked us to try to tease out some lessons for the left here and beyond, so I'll try to do that in the latter part of my remarks. So basically I'll be starting just with an overview of the current situation in France. And then, as I said, I'll hope to tease out some general observations that might be relevant to the left here and elsewhere. Now, I mean, for anyone who follows France with any kind of intensity, it would be very difficult to talk about the current situation in France without mentioning the Benalla affair. I don't know, hands up, who is at all aware of the situation in France with the Benalla affair? Okay. I mean, I don't really want to go into too much detail about it. There are actually, for those of you who don't read French, there are actually some good pieces I found in English on the New Yorker website and even on the Financial Times website. I won't get into too much of the detail. The important thing I would say about the Benalla affair, there's an excellent piece for those of you who do read French. There's an excellent piece on the Mediapart website. I'm not sure if you saw that one, where the writer uses the Hans Christian Andersen's short story of The Emperor's New Clothes to basically describe the situation that's been created with all the revelations around this scandal. So once again, not to get into too much detail, but the scandal basically involves a kind of nondescript employee in President Macron's entourage, who was later revealed to have basically attacked a couple of protesters during the May 1st actions. And this nondescript employee of Macron is, I guess, one of his main bodyguards, but also kind of handlers for public events and so forth. And he had donned full police equipment for the occasion. In theory, he was there only as an observer, but in fact, he ended up intervening directly, attacking a few demonstrators. Subsequent videos emerged that he'd also been involved in these types of police-type activities on May 1st itself, and probably on other occasions. And this is someone who had a very luxurious apartment near the Elysee, who was making about 10,000 Canadian dollars per month, and who was kind of totally outside any of the regulated framework for police work, protection of the president, and so forth. And I guess the scandal of the affair is that, he's received full, first of all, it reveals that you have this very tight-knit team around Macron that appears to be functioning in a kind of bubble that gets full presidential protection, and there's all sorts of buddy network around Macron. And Macron, after studied silence over several days after the affair broke, basically said, "Well, I shoulder full responsibility for this scandal." Now, it's hard to determine what the fallout will be, but I think it's likely to be significant. I mean, he's dropped a few points, I think, in the polls. Anyway, who knows what polls mean, but I think the impact will be significant because it really goes to the heart of the Macron project, the Macron presidency. Also in light of the fact that there has been significant protest and strike action in France, and as the others have said, there's also likelihood of some sort of financial meltdown coming. I think it's fair to speak of the Macron presidency before the Ben Allah affair and the Macron presidency after the Ben Allah affair. So what exactly is this nature of the Macron presidency? Now, I know it's interesting, at least until the Ben Allah affair, the the foreign media, for the most part, seem to have bought the whole discourse around Macron as this modernizing, young, dynamic, charming, handsome, excellent speaker, cultured, opponent of Trump, guarantor of the Paris Climate Agreement, basically a kind of savior of the center-left, someone who is kind of wearing the clothes that I suppose Obama was wearing up until the Trump victory. In fact, what we have with Macron in France is, in terms of the measures that he's unleashed since winning the presidency, it's almost like a government of class revenge, or I don't usually like throwing terms around like class war and all this. You have to be careful with language like that. But basically, it's a kind of a government of revenge of France's neoliberal ideologues, big business, and the right, because of the targets he's chosen. For example, attacking rail workers and the public rail service. This is very symbolic in France. One of the reasons it's interesting to talk about France, and it's not just because I live there that I talk about France, is that from the November-December protest movement and strike movement until all through the late 90s and early 2000s, and in some respects it continues to this day, but in the mid-90s it was significant that you had this big strike and protest movement in France because it kind of represented an initial break from those years of Reagan and Thatcher, those dark years from the early 80s to the mid-90s, along with the Zapatista uprising in Mexico, and I guess many people here would say with the Days of Action in Ontario in late 95 and early 96. It was a first break with what we'd seen all through the 80s and 90s. And the rail workers in the 95 movement were the backbone of that struggle. I always fondly remember going to these massive marches with phalanx of rail workers with their flares. They were really like, and especially after all that had happened in the 80s and early 90s, it really came, this idea of a working class hero was something to be, and of course the right, the neoliberals, the ideologues, the basic, the neoliberal technocrats and so forth, never forgave the rail workers for this, and so attacking the status of rail workers, their job security and so forth, attacking the public rail service was key, as was the attack we've seen on higher education and students. Again, in the right wing, in the pro-neoliberal memory in France, 1986 was a huge student movement. It's kind of the movement of my generation that defeated plans to create more selection in the university system and open the door to much higher fees and so forth. So there's this idea that they had to really teach these folks a lesson. And of course, the Macron government has deepened the attacks on job protection, on trade unions, that had already begun under the Hollande presidency, especially in the latter part of the Hollande presidency, but deepening them much further, abolishing the solidarity tax on wealth, negotiating the CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with Canada, which was a key, and it's important that people in Canada know this, was a key agreement in terms of a linchpin to open the door to the negotiating of more bilateral trade agreements, despite the consequences on people's lives, the environment, and so forth. And the list of, and especially since I think I have 6 minutes left, the list of measures, the kind of class warfare measures unleashed by the Macron government is quite breathtaking. And if the image again of Macron presidency abroad, especially, but obviously in France, at least among some segments of public opinion, was of this young, dynamic, diverse, hip kind of team of startup entrepreneurs who were going to break down all the old inflexible rigidities of the French economy and French mindset. In fact, if you do a look at actually what the Macron team is, if you look around, it's really a bunch of young men for the most part, white men for the most part, from the elite schools, drafted often directly into the Macron team from private sector, big business, the worst brand, the human resources, heads of human resources departments and those kind of folks. They're this tight team around Macron, and even among his ministers and so forth. It's true, I mean, and to his credit, and perhaps something similar could be said about the Trudeau cabinet here. It's to his credit, there were more women, there were a couple of non-whites, but often in positions of lesser importance, and even those, for example, the labor minister, is a woman, but she comes from, she was the head of human resources in Danone and other more major businesses. So she clearly is a woman with an agenda, a very neoliberal one, and so that's the nature of the Macron the Macron presidency. And they've gone much further and faster than even many of us on the radical left had expected. There was this idea that, especially since Macron in the second round had defeated Le Pen, around the subjects that Parastu and Stéphane mentioned, migrants, so forth, Frontex, and all that. There was this assumption that that Macron would be much less punitive and more open than the previous governments. In fact, the recently adopted migrant legislation, I don't have a point-by-point assessment in front of me, but I believe it goes further than what even Sarkozy, the hard right presidency of Sarkozy, had been aiming for in the 2007-2012 period. So, I mean, it's so for this scandal to hit now is very interesting. There is a kind of the emperor has no clothes, because the kind of the social violence and political violence it was certainly there to see in terms of how protest has been dealt with, the student protests in particular. My daughter was going to a junior high not far from the Arago lycée in Paris, where a number of the high school students had gathered for a meeting to discuss how to respond to this new, more selective regime of university admissions that Macron is implementing. And these are just high school students. I mean, they're kids, right? They're I guess between age 15 and 17, so forth. The police charged in, which is quite unusual, charged in and arrested them and held some of them overnight, not respecting any of the usual restrictions on how police are supposed to behave within educational establishments and in relation to minors. So that kind of social violence was there, but to see that there's that there's this kind of private crew of semi-goons around Macron who at least feel protected enough to be able to attack demonstrators on May 1st is, really, I think, took a lot of public opinion by surprise. And that's a politically important point, because Macron, as I guess many of you would know, kind of came out of nowhere. He'd never been elected to any position before. He'd been in high finance and so forth. Hollande had brought him into his cabinet, brought him into his team, and then named him Minister of the Economy. And then he created this movement around himself with his own initials. So his victory was really focused on himself. He had this image of being young and dynamic and so forth. And if you like, there was a segment of left opinion, center-left opinion that was, I would say, bamboozled, but they would say convinced by this idea of this image I described earlier. And I think many of those folks would be genuinely surprised. Although there is a team of sort of Macronite. What's the word? The people who go on internet and are always in trolls, Macronite trolls, who have been very, very active. If you read Le Monde or other websites, very active since the scandal broke. Okay, so maybe a few minutes. So the kind of lessons for the left, what kind of lessons can we tease out of all this? So under in the latter part of the Hollande presidency in 2016, and then again in late in 2018, it's not there haven't been significant movements in France. There have been significant protest movements. I described rail strikes and so forth. There have been significant strikes, sometimes quite massive, quite spectacular, and even innovative. If you think back to the Nuit debout movement in 2016, if you look at the movement against the Notre-Dame-des-Landes airport in the west of France. But the problem has been one of convergence, as has been the problem of consolidating these sporadic. I mean, in the case of the most recent wave of strikes, not so sporadic. It was spread out over quite a long time, but consolidating these into something longer term. In last year's presidential elections, the Jean-Luc Mélenchon of the France Unbowed or La France Insoumise, I guess you could say that he managed to gather together and capture a lot of the momentum that had built up through these different movements that I've described. But it turned out that was insufficient electorally. I mean, he didn't even get into the second round. I mean, for someone like me, it was amazing that anyone from the left of the Socialist Party did as well as he did. But still, electorally, clearly, it wasn't enough. And as for the party that emerged from that initiative, the France Insoumise, I guess you could say, to be charitable, that the jury is still out on where that's going, and I think it's fair enough to say that certainly on its own it's not enough. La France Insoumise, after the election last year, felt it had a kind of monopoly on left social opposition to the Macron government, and so it tried to really monopolize and organize demonstrations and other initiatives based solely on itself. And that clearly wasn't sufficient. I mean, Macron, again, up to the Benalla affair in any case, has won every round of social and political struggle in the country. And La France Insoumise, to its credit, was able to adapt somewhat to this. And so during the more recent movement, there were broader formations, broader forms of political organizing that emerged, where La France Insoumise played a more or less central role and was either forced to or agreed to accept participation from other forces. This could be maybe a broader. La France Insoumise perhaps reflects a range of problems afflicting a range of new electoral projects that have emerged. Their success is often quite impressive and unexpected, so La France Insoumise, but also with Podemos in Spain, or Corbyn in Britain, or Québec Solidaire in France, or of course the DSA wing of the Democrats in the United States. But they rely heavily on communication and the internet, and for those of us who are a bit older, sometimes maybe you should be wary of what you wish for, because it's true that the teams around these new forces are often quite young, and very talented, but often there's a sense that they form a rather cold-blooded inner circle around the individual that is their sort of great white hope, in most cases great white hope, and so the whole question of well what's the ideal organizational form that should emerge in order to deal with the huge challenges we face, and how far should they be focused on electoral questions. Clearly, elections are essential, and Stéphane rightly mentioned the European elections coming up. But it's perhaps wrong-headed to approach the question of building the new left and gathering together this kind of disparate range of forces through exclusively or primarily through the electoral from the electoral angle. And lastly, I'll just wrap up on the problem of the far right. I remember when I gave this talk last year, I mentioned how there were significant sections of the radical left who got into there's a big debate about whether we should be calling for a Macron vote in the second round. I was more of the opinion that, Le Pen is a serious threat, and it would probably not be a good thing for Le Pen to win. So I don't have the right to vote in France, but I felt that we should probably vote for Macron. But I fully understood those who disagreed with this, and their slogan was Macron 2017 equals Le Pen 2022. And we shouldn't lose sight of that, of how Macron, and I think the things that have come out of the harsh social measures I've described, the authoritarianism, the violence, there have been some corruption scandals already in the Macron regime. All of this lays the end of the hard position taken on migrants. Macron, like the Democrat leaders of the United States, feels that he can do this triangulation, that the left is more or less defeated, and in any case the left's going to support me because I'm Macron, I'm so great, against the Front National. So the whole discourse around migrants, around a whole series of other questions around security threats, terrorism, and so forth has been shifting rightwards in order to win over the right. And the far right, it was reeling, and I'm wrapping up now. It was reeling after the Le Pen defeat, although let's not forget they did quite well, and they're alive and well, and a lot of the forces that mobilized for the Front National are still very present. There are new forms. Stéphane mentioned there's a Génération Identitaire. They actually mobilize. They go into the Alps and try to target and block migrants trying to cross over from Italy. And so it's no longer just a question of people's opinions or trolls on the internet. You actually have forces now who are mobilizing. Okay, I'll wrap up there, and other questions can come up during the discussion. Thanks.